On a gray November morning, an excavator pulled a black timber from the wettest corner of Elias Ward's farm, and Elias told the operator to throw it on the burn pile. Then the bucket tooth peeled away the outer inch. Under the black skin was tight, pale wood from land the appraisal had valued at almost nothing. The operator shut off the machine. Elias climbed down into the trench and ran his hand across the fresh scrape. The exposed wood was not soft, it was not crumbling. It felt hard enough that the steel tooth had polished part of the grain. The timber was nearly 30 feet long, straight, and heavier than anything that dark had a right to be. 6 months earlier, Elias had bought the 96-acre farm in northern Wisconsin because he could afford the useful part of it. There was an aging house, a weather-beaten dairy barn, several open fields, and enough dry ground to make a small hay and grazing operation possible. The northern end was different. 31 acres stayed wet through most of the year. Sedges crowded the low spots. A pair of old drainage ditches had collapsed. Beaver activity had pushed water across ground that earlier owners had tried, unsuccessfully, to tame. The appraiser had been polite about it. The wet acres had access problems, drainage problems, and limited agricultural use. They contributed very little to the number Elias was borrowing against. Elias did not argue. He had not bought the farm because of the wet meadow. He had bought it in spite of it. Now a black timber lay beside a drainage trench, and the first clean scrape through its surface had revealed wood that looked nothing like waste. Elias did not call it valuable, not yet. He had spent enough years repairing fences, sheds, trailers, and other people's mistakes to know that one good-looking surface could hide a great deal of trouble. He cut a short section from the damaged end and carried it to a small sawmill 12 miles away. The sawyer, a man named Grant Bell, looked at the sample for less than a minute before turning it over and inspecting the end grain. Where did this come from? A ditch. Grant looked at him. A ditch where? My north meadow. Grant set the sample on the bench and scraped the black surface with a knife. He exposed another line of pale wood. He did not offer Elias a price. He did not tell him he had found treasure. He asked the question that mattered more. How much more of it is down there? Elias did not know. That answer bothered him all the way home. The next morning he returned to the trench. The excavator had crossed a low ridge of peat while clearing the old ditch. Beneath less than 4 feet of saturated soil, its bucket had caught not one timber but 3. 2 were too deteriorated to move in one piece. The third was the log now lying on dry ground. Elias walked 50 yards farther along the ditch line. A dark curve broke the water near a patch of cattails. He stepped closer and saw what looked like another trunk. Farther on, beneath a mat of reeds, there was another. The strange part was not that trees existed in wet ground. Trees fell everywhere. The strange part was the direction. Several of the buried trunks seemed to run roughly parallel to one another, as though they had not simply fallen where they once grew. Elias spent the next week doing something he had not expected to do when he bought a farm. He went looking for old maps. At the county office, the modern parcel map told him almost nothing. The wet meadow had changed shape repeatedly as ditches clogged, beaver dams shifted, and water levels moved. Older plats were more useful. On one early map, a narrow line crossed the northern property before disappearing near the river corridor beyond it. Another record referenced a timber landing in the area. A later road survey showed a short spur that no longer existed. None of the documents proved exactly what had happened on Elias's land, but together they suggested a possibility. Long before the farm had been divided into modern fields, the low ground may have been part of a working timber route. Logs could have been staged, floated, or stored in shallow water before moving toward a mill or rail connection. If a landing shifted, a dam failed, a channel silted in, or an operation simply moved on, some timber could have been left behind. Elias refused to turn that possibility into a story he could not prove. He needed the ground to tell him more. So he stopped digging randomly. Instead, he laid the old maps beside a current aerial image and marked the narrow zone where the suspected route crossed his property. Then he opened a series of small test pits only where the ground was accessible. In several places, he found nothing but peat and roots. In others, the excavator hit wood almost immediately. One pit exposed the end of a large trunk with a flat, weathered cut. Another revealed 2 logs lying nearly side by side. A third produced a disappointment. The wood looked intact until the bucket lifted it. Then the trunk broke in half and collapsed into dark, fibrous material. That failure was useful. It prevented Elias from making the first mistake people make when they discover something unexpected. He did not multiply the best example by the entire acreage. He began treating every buried timber as an unknown. Grant helped him cut small samples from 6 different logs. 2 were poor. One had a sound outer section around a badly deteriorated core. 3 contained broad areas of solid wood. The variation mattered. The wet meadow had not preserved everything equally. Some trunks had spent decades near the surface, where changing water levels repeatedly exposed them to oxygen. Others had remained deeper inside saturated soil. In those oxygen-poor conditions, the organisms responsible for decay could work much more slowly than they would on a log lying in open air. Water had not made the timber immortal. It had changed the speed and pattern of deterioration. Species mattered. Damage before burial mattered. Depth mattered. Whether a trunk had spent part of every summer above the waterline mattered. A log could be huge and still be useless. A smaller one could be surprisingly sound. That was the first real rule Elias learned. Size was not inventory. Condition was inventory. The second rule came from the sawmill. Grant opened one of the better samples on a band mill. The first slab carried the black staining Elias had already seen. The next cut exposed long, tight lines of grain. There were defects, but there was also enough clear material to make both men stop talking for a moment. Grant leaned closer. "Old pine, most likely," he said. "But don't start counting money." Elias laughed. "I haven't counted anything yet." "Good. Because wet logs don't pay bills. Dry boards do." That sentence became more important than anything else Grant told him. At home, Elias walked into the barn and looked at the repairs he had postponed. One roof section still leaked. The tractor needed hydraulic work. Fencing on the western pasture had to be replaced before spring. He had no room in the budget for a hobby that required excavators, winches, milling, storage, and months of waiting. If the timber was real, it had to become a process. If it could not become a process, it had to stay in the ground. The pressure behind that decision was not theoretical. Elias had put most of his savings into the down payment and the first round of repairs. Hay from the dry fields could cover part of the farm's operating cost, but it could not absorb an open-ended experiment in the North Meadow. Every hour of excavator time had a price. Every portable mill day had a price. A cable snapped once and had to be replaced. A buried log that broke during extraction still left a bill behind. The wet acres had been cheap for a reason. They were difficult to reach, difficult to cross, and impossible to evaluate with the same quick methods used on pasture. Even when a trunk proved sound, its weight created another problem. Waterlogged wood could be far heavier than dry lumber. A machine that handled a normal log safely on firm ground could become unstable near peat and saturated soil. So Elias made access part of the inventory. He marked firm edges where equipment could sit without sinking. He marked cable paths that could reach into softer zones. He noted places where a recovery would require crossing live drainage or tearing through rooted vegetation. Several promising trunks were downgraded for that reason alone. That frustrated him at first. A good log was sitting there. Why not take it? Because the log was not the only cost. The ground around it was part of the equation, too. The more Elias worked the meadow, the more the project stopped looking like hidden treasure and started looking like a chain of constraints. The wood had to be sound enough, the root had to be safe enough, the yard had to have space, the mill had to have time, the drying process had to be slow enough, and at the end, a buyer still had to want the board that survived all of it. That chain became his protection against wishful thinking. Elias began with a limited survey. He divided the wet meadow into narrow zones and recorded only what he could support with actual evidence. Accessible trunks received a location, estimated length, approximate diameter, burial depth, visible condition, and a recovery risk note. Test pits were closed after inspection. Areas that required too much disturbance were marked for later or left alone. By the end of the first month, he had confirmed 48 buried logs. By spring, after low water exposed more of the old corridor, the number climbed past 200. The count did not excite him as much as it would have earlier. He had already watched a large trunk disintegrate in an excavator bucket. He knew better. What excited him were the patterns. Deeper logs in one narrow band seemed to have a higher chance of sound wood. Trunks closer to the old ditch had suffered more oxygen exposure and mechanical damage. Some carried old iron scars or cut marks that supported the idea that they had been handled. Others may have been natural deadfall mixed into the same wet ground. The old maps could suggest history. The wood still had to prove itself one piece at a time. By early summer, Elias had enough promising locations to justify a controlled recovery batch. He chose 18 logs, not the biggest 18, not the easiest 18. He chose a mixture that would test the range of what the meadow actually contained. The first few came out cleanly. A winch pulled them across a temporary timber mat while the excavator stayed on firmer ground. Mud rolled from the trunks. Black water filled the cuts left by the cable. The next log twisted halfway out and exposed a rotten section Elias had not seen. Another contained a pocket of old embedded metal that forced Grant to stop the saw before the blade reached it. Still, enough of the batch milled well that Elias began to believe he had a workable resource. That was when he made his expensive mistake. The boards coming off the mill were heavy with moisture. Elias knew they needed to dry. He also knew winter was coming, and he hated the idea of waiting a year before learning whether the lumber would sell. So he tried to help the process. He cleared an upper section of the barn, stacked the new boards with spacers, added fans, and used heat from an existing shop heater to keep air moving through the pile. For the first 2 days, it looked efficient. Moisture left the exposed surfaces quickly. The boards felt drier. The black staining lightened on some pieces. Elias thought he had saved months. Then the first wide board cupped. A second developed deep-end checks. A third looked acceptable until Grant cut it and found internal cracking that Elias could not see from the outside. Within a week, one of the most promising stacks had become a lesson in what fast drying could destroy. The problem was not simply that the boards were wet. The problem was that different parts of each board were losing water at different speeds. The outer fibers were trying to shrink, while the interior remained saturated. Thick, wide material was especially unforgiving. Heat and moving air had not created value faster. They had created stress faster. Elias shut off the heater. He stood in the barn looking at boards that had taken money to recover. More money to mill, and only a few careless days to damage. The farm loan was due in 6 weeks. A hydraulic hose had failed on the tractor that morning, and his supposedly hidden resource had just turned into a stack of warped evidence that he did not yet know what he was doing. For the first time, he considered selling the remaining wet logs exactly as they came out of the meadow. A buyer had already offered to take several directly from the property. The price was not spectacular, but the buyer would handle transport and assume the drying risk. Elias could recover logs, load them, and get paid. Simple. The problem was that he now understood what he would be giving away. Not a fortune, not guaranteed premium lumber. He would be giving away the part of the process where uncertainty became information. Once a log was opened, dried correctly, and graded, its value could be judged on what it actually produced. Before that, both seller and buyer were gambling. If Elias sold everything wet, he would never learn which zones of the meadow produced the best material, which log profiles were worth the recovery cost, or how much usable lumber existed inside the black trunks. He turned down the offer. Then he stopped pulling logs. For nearly 2 months the recovery equipment sat idle. Elias used that time to learn the stage he had tried to rush. A kiln operator in the region explained that the first goal was not speed. It was control. Ends needed protection against rapid moisture loss. Boards needed even support. Stickers had to be aligned so weight transferred cleanly through the stack. Air movement mattered, but so did temperature, humidity, thickness, and species. Thick stock often needed a long, slow air drying period before any controlled kiln schedule made sense. Elias rebuilt his storage area. He moved the stacks out of the heated loft and into a covered shed with open sides. He leveled the foundations. He aligned stickers carefully. He sealed fresh board ends. He bought a moisture meter and started recording readings instead of guessing by touch. The surviving stock from the first batch became his training material. Some boards continued to move and were downgraded. Some developed cracks and were cut into shorter lengths. Some stabilized. Months later, a small group went through a low-temperature dehumidification cycle. The process was not dramatic. Nothing came out glowing. There was no moment when Elias suddenly knew he was rich. There was only proof. A wide board that had been black and waterlogged in summer came out dry enough to work. Grant jointed one edge, planed a face, and measured it again days later. It stayed flat. That was worth more to Elias than any story about buried treasure. It meant the process could work. The next recovery season looked nothing like the first. Elias did not chase a daily log count. Each potential recovery had to earn its way onto the schedule. A deep, sound-looking trunk might be rejected if reaching it required too much disturbance. A large log could be passed over if test evidence suggested decay. A smaller trunk close to the firm edge could move to the top of the list if its condition and access made the economics better. He added a simple scoring system to the ledger: condition, access, expected yield, handling risk, processing capacity. If the yard was full of green lumber, he stopped recovering more. That last rule saved him repeatedly. The wet meadow had held the timber for decades. It could hold it for another month while the drying shed caught up. By then, Elias's survey had expanded far beyond the first corridor. Seasonal low water and careful test work revealed multiple pockets of buried timber. Some clearly followed the old working route. Others were less certain. The working map eventually held more than 1,100 probable or confirmed trunks. That number looked impressive on paper. It was also misleading. Several hundred were poor candidates from the beginning. Some were too deteriorated. Some were too difficult to reach. Some lay in places Elias had decided not to disturb. Others could not justify their recovery cost based on what nearby samples had shown. The number that mattered was smaller. A little more than 600 made the active recovery list. That distinction changed the entire business. Elias was no longer trying to empty the meadow. He was trying to select the material that could survive every stage between mud and market. The first serious customer did not arrive because of a dramatic advertisement. He arrived because Grant showed him 3 boards. The customer restored older houses and needed wide pine for a stair landing. Modern material could do the job structurally, but he wanted boards with dimensions and character that matched the building more naturally. He inspected Elias's stock the same way Grant had. Moisture first, flatness, defects, usable width, length, then appearance. Only after the practical questions did he ask where the wood came from. Elias pointed north. The customer looked past Thorburn toward the sedges and shallow water. Out of that? Some of it. That order was not large enough to change the farm. It changed Elias's thinking. The buyer had not paid for mystery. He had paid for dry, stable, usable lumber that happened to have a remarkable origin. The origin added value only because the material had already passed the boring tests. More orders followed slowly. A furniture maker bought wide boards with strong grain and accepted natural color variation. A restoration carpenter wanted long, clear stock. Shorter sound pieces that could not become premium slabs still found uses in shelves, benches, trim, and smaller projects. Rejects remained rejects. Elias did not invent a premium category for bad wood just because it came from the meadow. That discipline protected the good material. Every recovered log kept its number through milling. Elias recorded which boards came from it, how much was rejected, how long the usable stock took to dry, and what grade it finally reached. Patterns that had been guesses became data. One section of the meadow produced large logs but disappointing yield. Another produced smaller trunks with far more consistent sound wood. The best recovery day was no longer the day when the biggest log came out. It was the day when a moderate log produced a high percentage of stable boards without damaging the ground or overwhelming the yard. The better process also changed how Elias sampled the buried timber. During the first year, he had focused on whether a trunk looked solid when it came out. That was too late. Recovery was already one of the most expensive steps. By the second year, he wanted information before he committed a machine and crew. Where a trunk was shallow enough, and conditions allowed it, he exposed only a limited section and inspected the surface. On a small number of candidates, he took narrow samples to compare density and internal condition. He also paid closer attention to what nearby logs had already taught him. If 3 trunks from one pocket showed the same deep deterioration, the fourth no longer received the benefit of pure optimism. If a zone repeatedly produced stable material, he could justify testing another candidate there. This did not turn the meadow into a predictable factory. Old wood remained variable, but it improved the odds enough to matter. Grant improved the mill side of the system at the same time. Every log was checked for old metal before the first full cut. The working hypothesis that some trunks had passed through of a historical timber operation made that precaution more than routine. A buried spike, chain fragment, or old iron dog could damage an expensive blade and send metal through the mill. Several logs carried stains that suggested metal had once been present. One produced an actual iron fragment close enough to the surface that the detector caught it before the saw did. Elias added the event to the ledger. Another cost avoided. Another reason not to price the operation by log count. The drying records became just as useful. Elias tracked board thickness, starting moisture readings where the meter could give meaningful comparisons, date stacked, date moved, visible defects, and final disposition. He was not running a laboratory. He was building a practical history of what his own material did. That record exposed a pattern he would have missed if he had kept rushing. The widest boards often attracted the most attention when they came off the mill, but they were also the boards that punished poor drying most severely. Some narrower pieces survived with less distortion and produced a better return relative to the labor invested. The impressive slab was not always the profitable slab. That realization changed his cutting decisions. Instead of chasing maximum width on every good log, Grant and Elias sometimes chose a sawing pattern that sacrificed a little spectacle for more stable stock. The choice depended on grain, defects, likely buyers, and what the drying yard could handle. Once again, the resource became more valuable when Elias stopped trying to make every piece look valuable. The operation became quieter as it improved. There were fewer emergency pulls, fewer heroic attempts to free a badly placed trunk, fewer piles of wet logs waiting beside the barn. A cable system allowed Elias to work from firmer ground. Temporary mats protected soft access points. Recovery paused during the wettest periods. When a route began to rut, he closed it. The meadow was a resource, but it was still a wetland. Elias had bought the land. It did not make every possible extraction a good decision. By the end of the second full recovery season, more than 200 selected logs had been processed. By the third, the total passed 400. The barn had changed with them. One bay held green lumber under controlled air drying. Another held stock ready for final conditioning. Dry boards were sorted by width, length, grade, and likely use. A small shop in the back allowed Elias to surface sample pieces for buyers without turning the farm into a furniture factory. He had discovered another limit there, too. Making finished furniture sounded like a way to capture even more value. In practice, it required a different business, different tools, different customers, and more time away from the work he was already doing well. So he stopped trying to become everything. He sold lumber to people who knew what to build with it. The market provided its own correction. Not every buyer cared that the boards had spent decades under saturated ground. Some cared only about dimensions and price. Others liked the history but still rejected pieces with movement, deep checking, or weak sections. A few wanted highly figured surfaces that Elias could not promise from every log. He learned to separate provenance from grade. A board could have a remarkable origin and an ordinary grade. Another could have both an unusual history and exceptional usable width. The story did not change the physical quality of the wood. It only gave good material an additional reason to be remembered. That distinction kept Elias from building the business around novelty alone. He sent samples to more than one kind of buyer. Restoration carpenters cared about compatible dimensions and appearance. Furniture makers cared about stability, grain, and defect placement. Small architectural shops sometimes wanted long, clear pieces. Buyers who could use shorter stock prevented some sound sections from becoming waste. Over time, the mix reduced the pressure to force every board into the same premium category. The rejected material also taught him where the economics ended. Soft, deeply deteriorated wood was not saved by a good story. Sections damaged by hidden rot were cut away. Boards that moved too much after drying were downgraded or rejected. Some logs never returned enough usable lumber to justify what Elias had spent recovering them. He kept those numbers too. Without them, the successful boards would have lied about the operation. By the third year, he could estimate a recovery candidate more honestly because he had both sides of the ledger. He knew what a strong log might yield, but he also knew what a bad one could cost. He knew how much space thick stock occupied while drying. He knew that milling capacity meant nothing if the yard behind the mill was already full. He knew that a customer asking for 30-inch wide boards did not mean the next 30-inch log would produce them. That knowledge was less exciting than the original discovery. It was far more valuable. The North Meadow had started as a mystery. The business grew only after Elias converted the mystery into categories he could act on. That decision made the numbers clearer. The farm had cost him roughly $150,000. For the first 2 years, the timber operation did not come close to that number. Recovery, milling, storage, rejected material, equipment maintenance, and drying losses absorbed too much. Gross sales climbed, but so did expenses. Elias learned to distrust anyone who talked about the value of a buried log without talking about the cost of producing a sellable board. By the 4th year, however, the picture had changed. He had sold enough dried lumber to establish real prices across several grades. He also had a substantial inventory of dry, graded material with repeat buyers already using it. Instead of asking one person for a dramatic appraisal, Elias did something simpler. He totaled actual completed sales. Then he priced only the dry inventory that matched grades and dimensions he had already sold. He excluded wet logs, questionable stock, unrecovered material, and anything that had not survived processing. The number crossed the amount he had paid for the farm, not profit, not cash sitting in a bank account. Gross realized sales plus conservative value in already processed, sellable inventory. The difference mattered. So did the comparison. The appraiser had treated the 31 saturated acres as little more than a drag on the farm's practical utility. After years of labor and loss, usable lumber from that ground had crossed the purchase price of the entire property on that gross basis. The house had been visible on the day Elias bought the farm. The barn had been visible. The fields had been visible. The timber had not. But invisibility was only part of the story. If Elias had pulled every trunk as fast as possible, he probably would have destroyed more value than he created. If he had sold every log wet, most of the processing value would have left the property. If he had treated every black trunk as premium wood, he would have buried himself in recovery costs and rejects. The wet meadow did not reward optimism. It rewarded selection. That lesson became most obvious near the end of the fourth recovery season. The active list had fallen below 100 logs. Elias knew where most of them were. He also knew which zones he would never touch. One autumn morning, he walked to a shallow pocket near the western boundary with the ledger folded under his arm. A large dark trunk lay beneath less than 2 feet of water. Years earlier, it would have been the kind of log that made him reach for a cable immediately. It was close to the edge, it was wide, it looked straight. It also sat inside a patch of ground that had recovered slowly from an earlier access route. Nearby samples from the same zone had shown poor internal condition. On paper, the trunk scored badly. Elias stood there for several minutes anyway. The old version of the project was still tempting. One more big log, one more impressive pull, one more chance that the black surface hid something exceptional. Then he wrote one word beside the number: leave. He moved to the next location. That decision would have made no sense to him when the first timber came out of the drainage trench. Back then, he had thought discovery was the important part. By now, he knew discovery was only an invitation to make better decisions. The final selected recovery happened 2 weeks later. The log was not the largest on the map. It was not the oldest looking. It was a medium-diameter trunk from a firm edge zone that had produced consistent wood all season. The cable came tight. Water moved around the buried trunk. Elias stopped the winch once to change the angle, then again when the log began to drag against a root mass. There was no rush. The yard had capacity. The root was stable. The recovery plan had already accounted for the risk. When the log finally reached the mat, Elias marked its number and condition before anyone moved it toward the mill. There was no celebration. The important work still had to happen: inspection, metal check, milling, in-sealing, stacking, drying, grading, maybe sale, maybe rejection. The meadow had taught him to stop confusing extraction with success. That winter, the house finally got the repairs Elias had postponed when he first moved in. The tractor's hydraulic system had been rebuilt. The western pasture was fenced. One section of the barn roof no longer leaked onto buckets during storms. Those improvements were real consequences of the lumber business. So were the invoices, the fuel bills, the broken blades, the warped boards, the wet boots, and the logs that never justified their recovery. The business had not turned useless land into effortless wealth. It had turned uncertain material into a controlled product, one decision at a time. In the small office beside the drying shed, Elias kept 2 maps. The first was the old county map that had sent him looking for a forgotten timber route. The second was his own. It showed confirmed trunks, recovered trunks, rejected zones, access routes, and areas marked to remain undisturbed. The second map had fewer dramatic stories in it. It had better information. By spring, water rose again across the North Meadow. Sedges disappeared beneath shallow floodwater. The old test pits were hard to find. Tracks from temporary mats softened and vanished under new growth. From the barn, the wet ground looked almost exactly as it had on the day Elias bought the farm. A visitor could still have called it useless. Elias would not have argued very hard. For hay, it was mostly useless. For easy access, it was terrible. For conventional appraisal, it was difficult to value. Those statements were not wrong, they were incomplete. One evening, Elias walked to the western pocket where he had marked the large trunk to remain. The water was clear enough to see part of its black surface beneath the reeds. He could have recovered it. He had the equipment. He had the buyers. He had 4 years of experience he did not have when the first timber came out of the ditch. Instead, he pulled the old survey flag from the bank and carried it back toward the barn. The black trunk stayed under the water.